xDuoo, I've loved so many of your products. The MT604, the TA-20 Plus, the TA-26, the xDuoo5 Pro. And now you've gone and done this. Don't you care? The TA-26 to me was the best version of an OTL amp, like the Dark Voice RIP, without going to the trouble or having the fun of building one for yourself in the form of a bottlehead crack. At $319 US, it seemed like a great deal for those wanting to get into the world of OTL tube goodness. And then xDuoo went and released the TA-66 and confused the heck out of me. Firstly, can we agree that the design of this is gorgeous? The embossed front panel, or whatever you call this pattern, the blue backlight, the plinth around the tubes, and the large smooth cherry red volume knob. But I'm getting distracted. What's confusing isn't how good it looks. We all know that xDuoo can make a gorgeous looking product. No, what's confusing is that the TA-66, which looks a lot sexier than the TA-26, is also just $249 US. Yes, I hear you, looks aren't everything and I agree, but there's more. Inside the TA-66 is point-to-point wiring, a design and implementation that's arguably superior to printed circuit boards because you've got more direct wiring paths and dedicated wires, and it's undeniably more time-consuming to make because, as far as I know, there's no way to automate it like there is with printed circuit boards. And that's still not it. There's also a stepped attenuator for changing the volume, although xDuoo call it a stepped potentiometer, so I don't know if it's working differently to what I'm used to. And that means that every step in the volume control comes not just with a nice little mechanical click, but also with perfect channel matching. There's no imbalance even at the lowest levels. So how or why did this amplifier come out $70 US less than the seemingly more basic TA-26? Or the TA-26S, which is basically the same amplifier as the TA-26, but it's got a 4.4mm balance connector on the front. Even though it's not actually balanced, it's just a convenience connector to a single-ended amplifier. Either way, the TA-26 or 26S seems to be more basic. It's got less frills and fancy bits and pieces like blue backlights. I don't think it looks as good, but it costs more. Well, one thing that may go in favour of the TA-26 compared to the 66 is that in the 66, they've changed the tubes being used and they've reduced the power output. The TA-66 offers only 200 milliwatts into a 300 ohm headphone like the trusty HD650 that so often gets paired with OTL amps like these. And the TA-26 offers more than double that at 500 milliwatts. That seems like a big loss of value right there, doesn't it? Except that when you actually look at the details, headphones like the HD650, the HD660, the ZMF Verite Open, all of these only need around 10 to 20 milliwatts to get to 110 decibels. So even with just 200 milliwatts available and taking into account the fact that some of those headphones do have much higher impedances at certain frequencies, you've still got way more power on tap than you actually need. So where's the catch? Why is the TA-66 so much cheaper when it seems to have so much going for it? I figured it must have been the sound, and maybe with the different tubes they're using it's not able to perform as well. So I darkened the room, I illuminated the tubes, and I did some listening. And I was still totally confused. The TA-66 sounded great to me. It's clean, punchy, dynamic, engaging, slightly rich through the mids but not too thick. It just sounded like a great budget tube amp. Perhaps I was missing something. You know how on some nights you switch on your system and every single thing you listen to sounds amazing? I thought maybe I was having one of those nights. So I thought I'd add some competition in the form of the TA-26 and see if that sounded even more spectacular. I couldn't find the normal stock front preamp tube for the TA-26, so I grabbed the new production Tungsol 6SN7 GTB tube that's actually slightly better than the included Chinese tube that comes with the TA-26. While we're talking tubes, it's probably worth noting that the TA-66 and the TA-26 both use the exact same Chinese-made 6N5P J tube in the power socket, and so that's not going to create any big differences between these two, we know that for sure, and so I figured it had to come down to that front input tube. The TA-66 runs a Chinese 6N2 tube, and I'd never heard those in action before, so I really didn't know what they brought to the table. But I digress here. listening to My Baby's Too Good to Me, among other tracks. The TA-26 delivered the lead guitar with a great sense of weight and authority, a little bit of distance from me as the listener, and it was just off to the left. Meanwhile, the rhythm guitar was strumming away right up at my left ear. I was listening with the HD660S2 at this time, and once again the sense of articulation from the rhythm guitar was just as good as it was from the lead guitar. There was also an excellent sense of space from the TA-26, and so there was a good distance from me to the vocals and the instruments, and a good sense of space overall in the soundstage. And so, with bated breath, I returned to the TA-66 for the letdown. But there wasn't one. The TA-66 really is that good. It is a more intimate presentation than the TA-26, so the soundstage feels a bit smaller, but that actually comes with other benefits. The vocals now on My Baby's Too Good to Me were really close and intimate, not in a claustrophobic way, but in a way that had me feeling like the singer was singing directly to me, versus on the TA-26, feeling like they were singing into a microphone that was a meter or two away from me. The TA-66 is more crisp and articulate than the TA-26. It's less rich and smooth, but it doesn't lose the liquid sense that tubes often bring to the sound. And I know that liquid is a funny term to use when talking about audio, but there's just something about listening to tubes where the music flows from them in a way that it doesn't tend to from a lot of solid state gear. And liquid's really the only word I can think of that captures that essence. It's what makes OTL amps like the TA-26, the TA-66, the Bottlehead Crack, the Linear Tube Audio MZ3, and the shit Volkwanger. It's what makes all of those such magical amps, is they've got this ability to get out of the way and let the music flow straight from the recording and into your headphones or your speakers. And speaking of speakers, the TA-66 is still also a preamp. So you can use it as a tube preamp, just like the TA-26. There's really no differences between these two in terms of the features available, and now the TA-66 sounds as good if not better. Nothing's adding up. As I listen more and more, the TA-66 was just different from the TA-26, but it was equally enjoyable. Other than soundstage size, it matched the TA-26 in every possible factor that I could think of, except for one. The bass from the TA-66 is epic. Not enhanced, but this is some of the tightest, punchiest, and most present bass that I've heard from maybe any amp, but definitely from any tube amp. It was shocking. On Pretty Lady, the deep bass notes at around the 1 minute mark had a weight and an impact from the TA-66 that I couldn't get from the TA-26 or even the much more expensive Linear Tube Audio Velo tube amp that's just arrived for review. The TA-66 is somehow delivering solid state like punch and control over the bass. I have no idea if this bass performance is coming from the point-to-point wiring, maybe the 6N2 tubes, maybe it's to do with some of the components the capacitors used inside the design. I'm not sure. In fact, the bass performance was so good that I didn't believe myself as I wrote up my notes. And so at this point in my note writing, I plugged the TA-66 back in and went back to have another listen to check if it was just all in my mind, and it's not. It's for real. So if you've been paying attention, you're probably a bit confused right now. I started off this review complaining to xDuoo that they'd made me sad, but all I've done since is say how surprised I am at the enjoyment delivered by the sexier and cheaper TA-66. Did I make a mistake somewhere? No, because there are two issues with the TA-66 that you probably need to know about. The first one is minor. They've continued to put the power switch on the back of a tube amp, and that's just silly. You need to turn these amps off after every session, and reaching over a hot tube amp to find a switch that's probably hidden out of sight is just a dumb idea when it comes to user interaction. I can definitely forgive it, but I don't like it. Where the real problem comes up for me is that their choice of the 6N2 tube is so obscure that there are almost no options available for you to go and tweak the TA-66's sound to your liking. There are some Voskhod 6N2P tubes out there on markets like eBay that are a direct replacement for the 6N2, and there's also the 6H2N and 6H2P tubes that appear to be a direct swap as well, but I haven't looked as deeply into those. I've ordered a Voskhod 6N2P to try, it hasn't arrived yet, but that's about all I could find with some quick looking around. Now, some will suggest that the 12AX7 is a replacement for the 6N2, but it's not a direct swap in terms of the pins. You'd have to rewire the socket, and then it's also got slightly different voltage and current characteristics too. So I don't think you can really consider it as a direct swap. So that's my problem. xDuoo have built an absolute killer amplifier in every possible way that I can contemplate to assess it. Price, design, features, and sound quality, but they've gone and hamstrung it by choosing a tube with very few options for tube rolling. I would have loved to see if the TA-66 could have retained most of its excellent sonic characteristics, but gained just a little bit more sense of space in the soundstage by rolling that front tube. But there just aren't enough options out there to try unless I get really lucky with the Voskhod I've ordered. Perhaps it's a good thing though. For those wanting to dabble for the first time in tubey waters, not having to worry about lots of options for tube rolling could be good. The TA-66 is cheap, it sounds great, and it's versatile enough to drive any headphone from about 40 ohms and above, except for those few that are really difficult to drive. And yes, that includes plain and magnetic headphones, as long as they're easy to drive like a Mesa Elite or even a HEADPHONE HE1000 SE. In other words, if the impedance is above about 40 ohms and the sensitivity is above about 95-96 decibels per milliwatt, then you're probably going to be able to drive it happily with the TA-66. I would personally recommend pairing something like the TA-66 with high impedance headphones because that's really where the magic lies. And indeed with headphones like the SV023 from Sivga, the Sennheiser HD650, HD600, HD6XX, HD660S2, or the ZMF Verite, Atrium, all the ZMF headphones with that 300 ohm dynamic driver in them, all of those are going to be beautiful pairings with the TA-66. So I definitely recommend it for high impedance dynamic driver headphones, but it's nice that it works with pretty much anything. So do you think the TA-66 sounds good? Of course you do. If you want one, I'll put some links in the description down below. For now, thank you as always to channel members, to Patreon members, and to those of you that send super thanks here on YouTube. And if you've enjoyed this video and you want more affordable audio goodness, then you'll want to click on this video up here next. For now though, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.